Guys, it's wonderful, guys and gals, let me say that. It's wonderful to be with
Um,
you again today. David is coming back on, and we will get into study. I did want to maybe just say that if you guys are comfortable with this, that we could do today's session in honor of Dean's father who just passed away. And
oh,
didn't have a chance to meet him myself, but we hope that Dean will be able to catch up on this session and in some small way be able to draw some strength from it and encouragement. So, just a quick introduction before we get into the lesson with Rav Johnny. You are joining us in Eno, and this is a project that's been 10 years in the making. Christians and Jews on this call today coming together, some on the continent of Africa, which someone last week told me it's not a country. I accidentally said Africa was a country. Not good. So we got North America, Africa, Middle East. We need some people in England. We need some people in the middle of Europe, and I'm sure we're going to get them soon enough. But Christians and Jews, there are disagreements in theology, elephants in the room of things that we disagree upon, and that's okay. We respect one another, we honor one another, and we celebrate the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures that the Jewish people have carried for generations. And we want to dig into that today with Rav Johnny. We're honored to have you with us. And with that, I'm going to pass the microphone on to you.
okay. So thank you again for a beautiful introduction, and our thoughts are most certainly with Dean as he, recoils from the terrible feeling of loss of his dear father.
Mm.
We're going to be speaking about a midah, a biblical trait of kin'ah, which means jealousy. And jealousy is a trait that we often speak of as it happens. In the series that we've covered, some traits seem to go almost unnoticed in general and religious discourse. Others certainly are touched upon on the street, in the church, and in the synagogue. And jealousy is, it's a very old issue, which is touched upon in many biblical narratives and is encountered in many different places. Most of us, probably in a workplace, have encountered feelings of jealousy, maybe even where we live, in terms of what people think of us or what we may think of others. So, jealousy is a very prevalent feeling. But what I want to try and do is unpack to a modest level what is this trait of jealousy? And in particular, I want to explore both negative jealousy and a kind of positive jealousy. We talked about similar things in previous sessions where we can distinguish between, as mentioned before, having a negative, hard neck, being stubborn from a bad place. But there are also occasions where being committed is a very good thing. So, similarly, in terms of jealousy, I'd like to explore the negatives and the positives. And we're going to try and have a deep dive into particular biblical areas. One is a narrative, but really one is, shall we say, an underpinning of much of the Bible. And here we have them. One is a story of Rachel and Leah, or Rachel and Leah, where, if you recall, Rachel proclaims, complains, and observes how she feels jealousy towards her sister when her sister has borne 4 sons and she has yet to bear even one child. And the word for jealousy is used there. Now, it's important to note there are many other stories where we think we see aspects of jealousy. Stories, for example, of Cain and Abel. Certainly, a strong argument could be made that that's a story underpinned by the midah, the trait of jealousy. But the Hebrew word kin'ah, the one that we have here, isn't employed there. And that means that we can read those stories in many different ways. And perhaps the central value that we're supposed to draw from that story isn't necessarily related to jealousy. But in the story of Rachel and Leah, that word is used. And what I want to do is explore what it means in that story. Beyond this, and this is part of the teaser, on a number of occasions in the Bible, and I've given the main examples, although there are one or two further examples, God is described as being a jealous God. And this, of course, begs the question, this is a question I asked you, in the teaser, which we'll have a chance to discuss later on, if God is jealous, then surely being jealous isn't necessarily a bad thing. Which seems like a very simple point. But since so many of us are trained to think of jealousy as a bad trait, have we ever taken a moment to say, well, if God defines himself as being a jealous God, not just on one occasion, but on repeated occasions, perhaps jealousy is more complex than meets the eye. Maybe there is a certain virtue, not mere vice, in jealousy, or maybe it's one of those kind of like double-edged swords. There's, of course, a bad side, but also a good side too. So that's really going to be our journey, and I suspect through our conversation, we'll touch on a whole other variety of things. So let's begin with the first text, which wasn't part of the teaser. The story, so actually we'll get to it in a second. We're going to get in a moment to the story of Rachel and Leah, but I want to begin with an interesting rabbinic teaching. And it's one which really reflective of values felt not just within Judaism, but beyond as well, which is how we generally think of jealousy as a bad thing. Here, this comes from Pirkei Avot, which is a collection of rabbinic teachings from around 2,000 years ago, otherwise known as Ethics of the Fathers. And in chapter 4 of Ethics of the Fathers, a teacher called Rabbi Elazar HaKapar says the following: jealousy, lust, and the pursuit of honor, remove a person from this world. Basically, they lead to a person's downfall. If a person gets involved in one, two, or all three of these things, then boy, are they in trouble. Jealousy, lust, and the pursuit of honor. And I mention this teaching because what it does is emphasize in very, very insistent ways how jealousy is a terrible thing. I mean, if it's listed as being one of the three things that take a person from this world, then certainly one would think that jealousy can never be justified or is never a good thing. But perhaps, like we're going to see with the biblical texts, this dimension of jealousy is only one expression of it. And with that in mind, let's turn to the story of Rachel and Leah, Rachel and Leah. And this spills over from Bereshit, Genesis chapter 29 and 30. You know the story where Jacob marries two sisters, Rachel and Leah, thinking first that Leah is Rachel, etc., and then committing himself to Rachel as well. However, there is a difference between these two relationships. Though Rachel seems to be more endeared in the eyes and heart of Jacob, ultimately Leah has children and Rachel doesn't. And especially since Jacob had already been promised that from him would children come, and these would be literally the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. Then the woman who doesn't have children clearly seems to be in the shadows compared to the woman who is having children. So let's just briefly read these verses, because this gives us some kind of context of the final verse in this series, which is the first verse in chapter 30. And the Lord saw that Rachel was hated, and so he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Leah is given this blessing of being able to give birth, whereas Rachel at this point is unable to give birth. And Leah conceives and bore a son, and she called him Reuben. And as the verses say, and I think we touched on similar verses in the beginning of our journey, that these names of these tribes mean something. His name is Reuven because the Lord has seen my affliction, and seen in Hebrew is Ra'ah. And then she has another child. And that other child, she calls him Shimon, because God has heard that he is hated. And the word heard is Sham'ah. And then she has a further son. And this son is going to be called Levi. And he's called Levi because to be melaveh is to be accompanied or attached with somebody. And that's what Leah hoped would be between her and her husband Jacob. And then not only does she have 3 sons, which is what was predicted because Jacob had 4 wives and he was expected to have 12 sons, she has a 4th son, which was considered to be a bonus. And he is called Judah because Judah means thanks. And we've touched on this concept before, that the whole notion of appreciation comes from the name Judah and even the name Jew itself. Now, we're going to come back to the point just made. Now, let's look at chapter 30, verse 1, which comes immediately after this series of verses. Now, of course, Rachel is seeing how her sister is having these children, and she is desperate to have a child. She's desperate just as a woman, but also as a wife of Jacob. She wants to please her husband who adores her. And we're told, Rachel Yaakov, and Rachel saw that she'd not borne any children to Jacob. Rachel ba'achota, and she was jealous of her sister. And she says to Jacob, she doesn't say it to Leah, she says to Jacob, Havali banim ve'im ein meta anochi. Give me children, if not, I'm dead. Now, as mentioned in the comment by, I presume, Yair, if not, I am dead. Through the point made in the previous slide that jealousy can take you out of this world, possibly so. But the question really is, what tone is this jealousy being expressed in? Is it jealousy of bitterness? Is it jealousy that Rachel wants Leah to, die and she will now become the prime wife of Jacob? Meaning, if I had to had a sliding scale of positive to negative, where would we pin this expression of jealousy? Is it bitter and almost malicious? Or is there a warmth to her jealousy? She doesn't want any harm to happen to her sister. She doesn't believe that her sister doesn't deserve children. It's just that she also wants children. You see, it's important to note, there is a type of jealousy where I want this, but I'm pleased you have it too. And there is a deeper type of jealousy where I want this and I don't want you to have it. In Hebrew, by the word kin'ah, meaning jealousy, is connected to the Hebrew word sin'ah, meaning hatred. There's a type of jealousy which isn't hatred. I'm pleased for you, but I also want that. And there's a type of jealousy where I'm not pleased for you. I don't want you to have that, and I want that for myself. So my first question really would be, what kind of jealousy is being expressed here by Rachel? Is it a vindictive, negative, malicious one? Or is it just almost a sad jealousy? You understand? I'm trying to make sense of it. Maybe my vocabulary isn't clear enough, but it's important to know, because previously we said jealousy takes you out of the world. And maybe here it's true. If a person can be so jealous, they'll want to die. But is it that same type of jealousy? So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think right away, I'm thinking she's jealous for something that's desirable and good. Rachel is desiring to have children. And so I think that the context of what she is jealous for, her statement is, give me children. So it seems like the jealousy, in a sense, we can talk, I would maybe just call it like an emotional energy. And then the direction that that energy is going is towards a good solution, which is to have children. I would also maybe theorize that the statement, I am dead, is an emotional death, where it's like, I just can't function. I won't be able to be who I am right now. I'm going to die emotionally, in a sense, if I do not have children, which might be a true statement, where she would have to mourn and become someone different than she is today.
Mm-hmm. So I totally agree with that reading. And that's why in many ways I see this statement as being different to the previous one. This one is, if you pursue jealousy, it will be your end. She's saying, I'm jealous, and without this thing, I feel I haven't even started. right? I feel I haven't even realized my role as a wife to Jacob and my desire to be a mother.
Mhm.
But it's not quite trying to. She's not trying to pull people down. She's just wanting to be lifted up. Does that make
Tony,
sense?
can I disagree a little bit?
It's in fact, sure, go for it.
Just I mean, just since I know the end of the story, right? And we know that in the next verses, she gives her husband her I don't know the word, like her slave or whatever you call it. So she will have kids. So I think that kind of shows a little bit that maybe it's not such a good jealousy, meaning she will additional women, so her sister's honor will not be as much. That's how I see it. Like, it won't be just the sister. It will be divided between a few women, so her sister will not be so much honored. And that's, at least to me, shows me that it's a little bit kind of a negative jealousy.
Well, I do agree that there is negativity in there, but I suppose what I'm kind of saying is I think there is, kind of vicious negativity, and then there's almost soft negativity. Like she wants it, but I don't believe that she wanted Leah not to continue to have her 4 children or anything like that. I agree, though, she then had to come up with these kind of creative solutions, because for her, the way she lays down this gauntlet in chapter 30, verse 1, absent of having some kind of connection to children, she feels she's totally unfulfilled. Rightly or wrong.
I do tend to agree with Yonatan, also because of the first verse that we see on this slide. We can see that in verse 31, it talks about that Leah was hated. It's almost like there is a struggle here between 2 sisters. Who is going to be the favored one, or who is going to be the more accomplished one, or who is going to have the higher standing? Rachel obviously started out being the loved one. She was the one that Yaakov wanted to marry. Leah certainly enters into this relationship in a very unusual way, let's put it that way. And it seems that throughout these verses, we can see this contention between the two. And I think that Rachel is feeling that she is losing ground in this relationship, and therefore she does what she wants to do afterwards. So this jealousy, I think, does suggest that there's something here. It could have been very different. They could have been very compassionate to each other. Rachel could have helped Leah with her feeling of being hated, and Leah could have helped Rachel with her sense of not having children. It could have been a different kind of relationship.
Well, I agree. I think it's one of the reasons why it's so fascinating is, we're familiar with these stories. You look at them again, and there is somewhat, I think there's some ambiguity, but I acknowledge the fact that it can be read in a variety of ways, in terms of not just the measure of feelings, but the directionality of those feelings. Obviously, this is also part of the whole story in Genesis of Bereshit, where you have many sibling rivalries anyway, and where it's interesting, of course, that female sibling rivalry, if you could call this one, is a far, far different tone to that of the male sibling rivalries that we've seen previously, and we will be seeing after this point in time. Nevertheless, what we have here is an expression of jealousy. And what I'd like to do is highlight 2 different approaches from our classic commentaries, precisely acknowledging the variance and the variations of approaches to this text. So here, for example, is the commentary of a great Bible commentator called David Kimchi, right? A 12th century Bible commentator, and one who was respected for his simple reading of text, meaning trying to get to the basic explanation rather than additional explanations which don't draw directly from the text. And David Kimchi says she was jealous due to the fact that she had seen how her sister had given birth to 4 sons, and she hadn't even born one child. I mean, this is all about the kids. This isn't necessarily personal to Leah, or necessarily even that toxic towards her. This is all about the kids, but certainly there's a tone of negativity, of loss, of frustration, of anxiousness. That's David Kimke's approach. But I want to present you a different approach of perhaps an even more well-known Bible commentator from just a century or so beforehand, called Rashi, Shlomo Yitzhaki, quoting actually a wide variety of opinions. And he says that she was jealous of the good deeds of her sister. And she said to herself, perhaps because she's more righteous than I was not worthy to bear children. Meaning, according to Rashi, her jealousy was not even for the children. It was for Leah's spiritual level, which enabled God, which warranted God blessing her with children that perhaps Rachel did not deserve in her own eyes. Now, what's interesting when you contrast these two commentaries is how one is all about the kids, and there's a tone of frustration, disappointment, and perhaps not necessarily anger, but sadness. And the other one is actually a tremendous compliment to her sister, Leah. She's saying, I'm jealous of how great you are. I'm jealous of how wonderful you are. I wish I was like you. The first one says, I wish I had what you had. The second is, I wish I were who you are. And if you were to look at all the other commentaries on this verse, you would find that some fit more into the former camp and some fit more into the latter camp. But I think that's particularly striking because one suggests that jealousy is about wanting what somebody else has. One suggests that jealousy sometimes is about admiring someone else, wishing to achieve what they've achieved, wishing to be like them, not taking away from them. And merely by taking a glance at these verses, I think we see the different possibilities and directions and interpretations of jealousy in the Bible, certainly with respect to this verse. So, my question for our first part of the discussion, which we don't need to do this now on breakout rooms, but we will doing so with about God and the teaser question we had before. Was Rachel's jealousy good or bad? Well, I mean, in light of what you've just seen and our conversation and the contributions made here and the interpretations we've presented here, what would you say about Rachel's jealousy? What are your thoughts about, was it good jealousy or is it a bad one?
Don't you have to know the motivation that's within her to be able to say that? Right,
I agree. Basically what that tells me is when the word jealous appears in the Bible, I don't know enough to necessarily interpret it as good or bad. I know it's a feeling of want, but maybe it's a feeling of want of having what somebody else has, and on occasion that they themselves no longer have what they currently have. But maybe jealousy is about being like them because I admire them so much, wishing to emulate them, wishing to follow their footsteps. A bit like Rashi says that Rachel was jealous of Leah's righteousness. Basically, if you were to take these two commentaries, you would probably say Radak sees the jealousy as being maybe good, maybe bad, depending on the tone, but that's by no means certain. Rashi sees the jealousy as good. It's actually beautiful. It's actually a really remarkable type of jealousy, saying, that's so lovely for her. And the reason I'm being so insistent on this topic is because I think a lot of us have many decades of prejudice about that word jealousy. And when it comes up, it triggers that we think certain things. And I don't believe that's necessarily as clear-cut as the Bible demonstrates. And though there are moral teachings, like the first one I showed, where it says, jealousy, lust, and the pursuit of honor removes a person from that world. And that context is clearly a very negative type of jealousy. There are other teachings, especially biblical teachings, where it's by no means so evident, where jealousy may well be something more positive. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Now, before we go on to the next series of verses about God, which we saw in the teaser, I'd like to present to you a rabbinic teaching, which comes at the end of a very, very long series of discussions. A long series I didn't incorporate, but I want to tell it to you, and then I'm going to show you the rabbinic teaching. And, you know, the Bible, as interpreted by the rabbis, deals with lots of questions relating to business ethics. You know, is it appropriate to lend money and interest? We know that's a no. But also, to what extent is competition acceptable or fair? Or to what extent can it denigrate or diminish the earnings of a neighbor or a friend? And the rabbis in the Talmud spent quite a lot of time discussing competition law. And they basically ruled that if a person, let's just use an example, if a person has a bakery in a small village, to open up a bakery right next door is not particularly fair, because they're almost immediately going to be losing out from customers. You can open up a bakery, but be a little bit considerate of the persons already working in that neighborhood. Be reasonable so that you are not in direct competition with them. However, when discussing education, when discussing schools, when discussing teachers in a neighborhood, the rabbis took a different view. And they basically said, if you have a school in a neighborhood, and you open another school, if you have a private tutor, can another private tutor come along? And they said, absolutely. And why? Because they say the following: jealousy among teachers increases wisdom, or in Hebrew, kinat sofrim tarbeh chokhmah. What they mean is there's a type of jealousy of competition between people who peddle wisdom, which only does the students of that wisdom good, not bad. If there's another teacher, then perhaps a student who was failing with the present teacher has another option. If there's another school, maybe people who are going there who aren't doing so well can go there. The more teachers, the more they each up their game. The more schools, the more they improve their standards. So when it comes to education, jealousy, and they use this word deliberately, jealousy among teachers or among schools increases wisdom. It's good for the students. And though this isn't a biblical teaching, it's a rabbinic teaching, what it's doing is using the word kin'ah, jealousy, a bit like the way we used it here with Rashi. It's jealousy to do better, jealousy to improve oneself, not to diminish somebody else. Jealousy to up your game and try and raise your standards. And this, by the way, is a codified law. The Jewish law allows competition in all aspects of education, wherever you are, no matter how well entrenched one particular institution is, because we believe that jealousy and competition in the field of education is beneficial to all those who wish to grow and learn and gain. And this serves as a further piece of evidence that there are types of jealousy which are not just acknowledged as having an element of goodness or positivity in them, but in this case, the very fact that such jealousy exists is the reason why such competition law gives a pass, gives grace, allows for multiple teachers and schools to open up in the same neighborhood. So just before we get to our next section of learning, are there any thoughts about this rule? Again, I'm showing you really the punchline of a much, much longer discussion. What it does is highlight how kin'ah, jealousy, in this case, is considered to be a positive thing which pushes people forward. Just like I want to be as fast as the fastest marathon runner, that's a good type of jealousy. Well, I want to be as good as the best teacher in town, that's also a good type of jealousy.
You might say that also wanting to have the best product on the market might also be a positive form of jealousy.
I think so, although I think when it came down to products, if they were different products, there wasn't a problem of competition law. When they were the same, then they were. But there's generally an understanding that wisdom is different based on the teacher and the learner. So you know, when we talk about product, I suppose it works differently, but entirely correct, yes. Any further thoughts about this? It's not such a central aspect of our learning together, but it's one certainly worthy of making mention of.
It's interesting that Melech David, he prays, he said, Hashem, make me wiser than all of my teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So he makes this prayer in Tehillim. And so I think that's very, very interesting that this exists in the Talmud. Jealousy among teachers increases wisdom. So,
right, it's as if this type of jealousy is not just an okay type of jealousy, it is an encouraged type of jealousy.
It is, right? It's a competitive, but a good competitive, yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
And again, all I'm trying to do here is highlight how the word jealousy is much broader than we often think in terms of that original statement where jealousy is seen to only have a negative. Of course, it's a negative if applied incorrectly, if directed maliciously, right? If, you know, employed vindictively, if done to pull somebody down, if the kin'ah is like sin'ah. But if the kin'ah is a motivating force for growth, for refinement, for learning, for education, then we are harnessing perhaps what innately may well be a more hardwired negative emotion to turbo boost towards a positive outcome.
I'd like to throw in something here.
Please.
And that is that if people are insecure in who they are, then I think that's where jealousy can lead to the negative. But if you're secure in who you are, then you can look at it in a positive way, like you said. And so as a teacher, then I will, you know, I will try get some wisdom so I can do better. But if you have a poor self-image of who you are in God, I guess, especially would be, well, then, you know, you're going to go to the negative and you're just going to be envious of what the other person has. Just a thought.
I think that's a very, very important thought, that our feelings are rooted in our self-confidence or insecurities. And in actual fact, one of the things we need to be is secure, and security comes from our belief that God cares about us. And if we believe that, then what other people think about us will matter less. So that's why faith and self-confidence are interrelated. And sadly, in a world where faith seems to have been marginalized in the public space, ironically, self-confidence we think has increased, but actually it's not. There's a shallow self-confidence today. There's a real paucity of deep, sincere self-confidence in decision-making, for example. In fact, I should just briefly mention for no particular reason, I review books from different publications, in particular Jewish publishers. And I was recently asked to review a book titled, "What Do You Really Want? Trust and Fear in Decision-Making at Life's Crossroads and in Everyday Living." And the author, Shana Goldberg, explains that today, so many young people lack confidence in themselves and the decisions they take. And a lot of it's to do with the way in which the world has become, that we don't quite believe in ourselves enough. And sometimes we're always comparing ourselves at the cost of feeling good about who we are, no matter what we do. Anyway, that's a whole different lecture for another time, but it's in my mind and I appreciate you sharing. Let's now move on. Sorry, please.
I just wanted to say that if you look this word up, kina, in a lectionary, it says you can translate it as either jealousy or zealous. Jealous or zealous. So zealous is like the zealots who defended Israel. Could mean somebody who's very tenaciously pursuing something that they believe to be right, similar to the idea of stiff-necked.
100%. The truth is, when preparing this material, sometimes Bible commentaries try to do us a favor, but sometimes lose nuance in the process. So sometimes these words are translated as jealous, sometimes as zealous. And in terms of the person who was most zealous in the Bible is Pinchas, which in the Torah portions we're going to soon be reading the story of Pinchas, who stood up with zealousness for the honor of God. The question really is what, how do we understand that? I think one of the reasons I was reluctant to mention this is jealousy is a word we often misunderstand, and zealousness is another word we often misunderstand. I do agree, though, that they deserve a second look. Zealousness is often seen to be harsh, actually it's to be committed. And jealousy is often thought to be malicious and vindictive. And often we're seeing here, it can be much more thoughtful and growth-oriented. And part and parcel of the mistakes we sometimes make is both by relying on translations and not probing deeply in terms of how these words are used in the Bible, we have an incomplete picture of what these words mean. So definitely jealousness and zealousness are related. I do believe that both of those English words do mean profound things, but over time we've narrowed their meaning. And what I'm trying to do is, I suppose, restore their breadth of meaning, which once we do that, we realize each have, as I say, a positive dimension. But I really appreciate you saying that, and I think it's super important. So let's now look at some verses I'd sent in the teaser, because I do want to make sure we have time for a breakout session, since last time we didn't, I got into trouble. Which is, where I mentioned before how God is referred to as a jealous, or in fact, interestingly, as Rumpa mentioned, zealous God. And in a variety of settings, mostly in terms of the Ten Commandments, here we see there in Exodus chapter 20, and we have similar in the book of Deuteronomy. God speaks about being a jealous God in terms of faith in God, in terms of chapter 34 of Exodus, in respect to idolatry. God says, don't serve idols, I'm a jealous God. Here in Deuteronomy, God is described as a consuming fire, jealous God. And similarly, if the people basically ignore the will of God, if they destroy the covenant, God describes himself as being a jealous God. And what I asked in the teaser is a very simple question, which is what I'd like us to do a breakout session now, because some of you may have had a chance to think about this and some of you not, is if we're supposed to emulate God, which itself, by the way, is a commandment in the Bible mentioned there in Deuteronomy, And if God is a jealous God, then surely jealousy is a positive, not a negative trait. So that was my question. And rather than just sharing those now, because I think some people here had a chance to think about that and some not, what I'd like us to do, if that's okay, is for us to have a breakout session of maybe 5 or 6 minutes, maybe just to give a bonus or make it 6. And then we'll come back and reflect on our thoughts on this topic. Speaking in our group and Zoom did its thing.
We needed more than 6 minutes.
I don't know who decided 6, but when I speak to that person, I'm going to give it to them. It was supposed to be 8 to 10.
I think they should be 10 minutes personally. I'm really, because
I think there was, our group was really getting very, into a really interesting conversation. So, okay, good. We can share it here.
I mean, technically we could do it again, but I suspect it's going to put us in different groups.
Right? No. We'll continue here together.
I'm just jealous of the people who had 10 minutes. So.
So I mean, I guess open floor. David was midway through his sentence when we stopped. You guys seem to be also in an animated conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, David was in the middle, so he can.
Yeah, David, do you want to continue where you were at? Or actually, don't continue because nobody knew what you first said because it was just with a group of us. But would you like to share your thoughts? With us?
You're muted, David. If you don't know, you're muted. Just in case.
And Edward gave a wonderful response, I think, in our group. So perhaps he could start and share it here.
Beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. What I said was jealousy for God is similar to the jealousy in an intimate relationship between a husband and a wife. Usually, for the case of the husband, you won't want it to see your wife get intimate with another man, and vice versa. Your wife won't like it when the husband is intimate with another woman. So in the same way, God is jealous for our devotion, our worship, our commitment to him, and he doesn't want us to share that intimacy with any other god, small god. In the same way, he was so angry with Israel when the golden calf was built in the Exodus. So in the same way, for us as God-fearers, it's also good to have that jealousy for the things that seek to take away our devotion from Hashem. Yes.
Well, I love the way you phrase that, Edward, because, and really you can tell this is part of my thesis, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts, but there is a certain heartfelt lovingness in the jealousy of God. And I believe that though sometimes jealousy can be toxic and negative and can burn a person from within because of its destructive quality, jealousy can also warm a person because of their desire to enrich and strengthen relationships, and enrich and strengthen personal growth. That's what we were discussing with Rachel and Leah. That's what we were discussing about the teachers in the same town. And jealousy is an emotion which can be directed in different places. And God's jealousy is rooted in this notion of a relationship. If you recall, our first session we ever had together was titled Faith is a Marriage. And so that's really where all this jealousy comes from. Anybody else would like to share their brilliant thoughts, just as we've heard before?
Yes, my own view is that if jealousy is part of God's character, we are supposed to emulate him in every way. Mm-hmm. And so we need to do it the way he does it. I think the problem with the jealousy of men is that it tends to be tainted by the fallenness of man. If we can identify where the fallenness of man, how it comes about to taint the kind of jealousy which we should emulate from God, then we'll get it right. But as long as we do it from man's perspective, then we won't get it right. But if we can identify how God does it, and I think I like Edward's response. I think in him, his things are perfect. So his jealous will be perfect. So that's what we need to follow. What are the elements that make his perfect? And what are the elements that make ours imperfect? If we can get rid of our imperfectness or imperfection, then we'll be able to do it the way Hashem does it or likes it, would have us do. Thank you.
To take what David said, for example, back to one of our first sessions with Rav Johnny, when he talked about Hosea and how God was, because he loved Israel so much, he was willing to forgive all the terrible things. And even when we strayed away, he went and he took care of us, even to make sure that we were taken care of. In other words, jealousy can also be in the, or like somebody mentioned earlier about zealousy. A zealousy can actually be a tremendously powerful drive to do good and to care about someone and to take care of their needs, even when they are not necessarily worthy of that care. So that's the difference perhaps between a divine zealousy and the more fallen forms of jealousy that we find with mankind. I love that answer.
You know, the zeal has to do with a certain kind of passion. If you care that much, then you're really invested in a relationship that means a lot to you. So there can be good zeal.
I love all the things that have been said. I'm so taken by this development of an idea of perfect jealousy, that there is this clarity, absolute pureness of the jealousy of God, which none of us can necessarily quite achieve. But if that pure, it's a pure good. But most of us don't achieve it. But if we get close enough, it switches from being a negative chemical, shall we say, to being a positive one. I'm so really, it's a beautiful idea. Anybody else with any further thoughts on this topic?
You know, I had a thought, actually a memory popped into my mind, take me back to Chicago. And I had a bad landlord. He was just a bad man. And we had to, our life, we had, I'm not going to take long on this story, but just we happened to be in an area of Chicago that was a little bit degenerate. and this caused actually one of the neighbors to threaten the life of my sister-in-law, or my sister-in-law's sister, who I was sharing an apartment with. So we had to move. And our lease was up. We had faithfully paid everything, but he would not return our security deposit. And I remember having this very strange sense that Hashem was going to deal with this issue in a very clear way. And there was this thing where I thought, you know, Hashem is jealous over me. He's jealous over me. He cares about what's going to happen. And I don't, you know, I'm not married. I don't have a husband to defend me. He's going to take care of this. And I remember about 2 or 3 weeks later, after we moved into the new apartment, that we received a phone call and our apartment had just burned, completely burned. The fire started, an electrical fire, and it completely decimated the entire apartment. And I remember, you know, the Torah says that Hashem, he says, vengeance is mine. And then he talks about that he is a jealous God. And so there's the two sides. He's jealous if we go after idols, but he also is jealous over us. And he's not going to allow things to happen without responding. So that memory just has come to my mind several times as we were sharing on the relationship issue. And so that's it from a single perspective. That's all.
Hey, Jonathan, were you going to make a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say what I said in a group. I feel that jealousy is an emotion, meaning you can control if you feel it, just like love. But you can control how you act on it. And that's what makes, you know, jealousy something good or bad. What do you do with jealousy? Do you try to push forward and achieve more, or do you go to do something bad about it? I think that's the difference.
I agree. Absolutely agree.
Wow. Well, I've been really, really uplifted and inspired by so many of these beautiful ideas. What I want to just briefly do is just review and then conclude. So I'll share the screen again. I decided in the end to put this as a PDF rather than just use it as a PowerPoint before. So we began, let's make this a bit smaller. We began with the trait of jealousy. And we talked about these two areas of the Bible. We mentioned there is a toxic concept called jealousy. But then we've seen expressions of jealousy, which perhaps may well be just about having what others have that you don't, but may well be about aspiring to be like others. And ultimately, it's hard to know what jealousy is until you know what's in the heart of another. And there are even examples of positive jealousy, which are seen to be the engine that drives growth forward and drives wisdom forward. In terms of God, God's jealousy is an expression of love, of affection, of marriage, of loyalty, of wanting people to be committed to God as God is always committed to people. And as a result of that, this jealousy is a good thing. But as mentioned just now, that jealousy is a pure thing. And if we can distill our jealousy to make it as pure as, or close to as pure as it is with God, that won't just affect and drive us forward in terms of our learning, but in terms of aspiration to become better people, but in terms of all of our aspects of divine worship. We may see somebody praying and they inspire us. And we're jealous of them, not because we wish them harm. On the contrary, we say, I wish I could pray like that person. That's a good type of jealousy. That's a pure type of jealousy. I'm not trying to detract from them. I'm trying to grow from them. And if we understand how to harness this powerful emotion, as Jonathan said, called jealousy, but harness it in the right way, I think a lot of us can do well. If we fail to learn how to harness it, a bit like a horse, which is wild and you don't know how to control it, boy, it can be taking you in directions you don't want to be going in. As it said in the Ethics of the Fathers, jealousy is one of the three things that can take you out of the world. So ultimately, jealousy is a feeling. And we need to learn to make and tie and hold the reins of it and figure out how we can lead it to the good places in the world so that we become better as individuals. So those are my brief thoughts on jealousy. I thank you all for this great opportunity, again, to share great ideas, and thank you for teaching me so much, because you all certainly have done so. I wish you all a great week. And also, just to conclude as we began, our thoughts obviously with Dean and his family as they mourn the loss of his father. And, you know, when you reflect on a life lived, that too can be a source of great inspiration of wanting to emulate that person and live according to their values. I'm sure that's where they are right now.
Amen. Well, thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Next Sunday.
Definitely.
So we will be.
Have a wonderful week, everyone.
We will be sending an email this week, so you'll be receiving the update for next week's meeting. And we'll see you next week.
Go to YouTube, make sure you like it and subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone who joined us on YouTube. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, everybody. Bye, Phoebe. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Edward. Bye, David.
Bye, Switzerland. Goodbye, Switzerland. See you later. You and Israel, we hope. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice week.
Bye, Claire. Bye,
Good
Tom.
night.
Bye, Edward. Bye, David.
Bye-bye.
Bye.